Hey, you. Want to know a secret? Lean in. Lean in close. Closer. I really love Chaotic. Chaotic is seriously a masterclass on how to properly design a trading card game. It's a versatile deck building experience that really lets you put your creativity on display with each army that you get to build. As I know from playing competitive Yu-Gi-Oh!, card games are at their absolute worst when you kinda just sit there and watch your opponent play solitaire by himself for 10 minutes, building an unstoppable board that you can't even take down without literally burning your opponent's cards. The thing that makes Chaotic so appealing is that for the most part, the game makes you always feel like you're having a real back and forth with your opponent, making it a really dynamic card playing experience. However, with the game potentially making a comeback, I thought that it would be kind of fun to look back at some of the shortcomings of Chaotic's gameplay and see if there were a few things that could be fixed so as to ameliorate the player experience. I was pretty deep into the competitive meta back when I used to play, and by comparing notes with the small but passionate competitive community that still exists, I've put together a list of 5 things that the developers of Chaotic should work toward fixing in the next version of the game. If you don't remember or don't even know all the rules to the game, don't worry, I'll be walking you through the details when necessary. So without further ado, let's play. Standard games of Chaotic are fought with armies of 6, with your offensive creatures taking a stand at the front of your triangle formation and your support units taking the back row. In Chaotic, having a supportive back row is essential for the majority of armies. You oftentimes need a healer, stat booster, debuffer, or back row damage dealer, and you sometimes even have to have a key character all the way in the back as a central focus of a given strategy. This is why cards like Zelf and Buy Mowercycle were so notoriously over-centralizing in the Chaotic metagame. Zelf can give your creature Swift 2 and Range, the former of which lets your front row creature move an extra 2 spaces forward, and the latter lets you travel atop your opponent's creatures without having to actually fight them. Basically, you can take your aggro unit and jump him all the way to the opponent's back row instantly. Buy Mowercycle works similarly, as it lets you give a creature that already has Swift 1 the ability to jump to the opposing backline. Now, I want you to imagine a game where you can just teleport behind your opponent's army and snipe out their major support units with a little counterplay. That would be pretty stupid. To be clear, the reason that back row is so important is because your support units usually have these things called Mugic counters, which allow them to play specific support Mugic spells. Back row creatures also usually had really cool supportive abilities, but were kinda soft and squishy to the point where you'd never really see them surviving combat for too long. And so this back row sniping became known as back row hate. Back in the day, there were essentially only 2 ways to counter back row hate. The first was to rely on defenders, which were an archetype of creature that you could use to jump in and rescue your back row, assuming they were adjacent to each other. Relying on defenders is because very few creatures even had defender, and you were also stuck taking up a precious slot in your army to pull off this maneuver. It was kinda risky. The second way to counter back row hate was way more popular. Just run back row hate yourself and cause some mutual destruction. This just makes the game less fun to play overall though, because now both players are stuck playing the whole game without support units, and that just kinda kills one of the more fun and interesting dimensions of the gameplay. Even when my friends and I used to play during lunch in high school and we were a bunch of young idiots, we knew that back row hate was so overpowered that we actually banned it. And this is coming from a bunch of dumb 14-year-olds who didn't understand game design. Even we knew that back row hate was broken. Fixing the problem of back row hate can be done in one of 3 ways. 1. Don't make cards with the ability to generate back row hate at all, unless pulling it off consumes a ton of resources. 2. Implement a rule that prevents striking the very end of the back row early on in the game. And 3. Introduce a new mechanic or widespread ability that allows for many creatures to have defender-like abilities. Chaotic's playmat structure is one of its cooler idiosyncrasies that fans are gonna want to see again when the game finally comes back, but back row hate just doesn't have any place in this type of game. And rightfully so, the competitive community has banned cards such as Buy Mowercycle. Not sure what Zelf is still doing there, but whatever. Unlike games like Magic and Yu-Gi-Oh!, Chaotic has your creatures actually throwing attacks out from an attack deck. When a creature's health stat hits 0, it is sent to the grave. So the goal of the game is usually to deal as much damage as quickly as possible, though there are some very interesting innate deck building mechanics that allow for a ton of nuance in how you go about attacking. When you're building your deck in Chaotic, you want your attack deck to have synergy with your army's strengths. In general, you had elemental attacks, challenge attacks, and stat check attacks for dealing damage. At least these were the most frequently printed damage dealing outlets. For reasons I'll avoid getting into now, stat checks and elemental attacks were by far the most popular forms of attacking due to their consistency. Stat checks and elemental damage were very simple. Does your creature have a wisdom stat of 50? If so, deal 5 damage. Does your creature have the water element? If so, deal 5 damage. Attacks like these were very consistent to get off because their outcomes weren't as contingent upon what your opponent was running. So imagine building a deck that is a mix of elemental damage and stat checks, and all of a sudden, you get this jerk face showing up in the opposing army. Just take a moment and read this lovely card text. Take it all in. Let that ability sink in, and understand that if you were to ever see that text in-game, the only thing that would go through your mind would be, well, I guess I don't get to play the game today. Basically, certain cards in Chaotic let you eliminate a given elemental type from your opponent. Cards like Newman Voidland, Lord Von Bloot simping for Ani, Elemental Elegy, and several more just took massive dumps on your opponent's attack deck, to the point where armies that were even somewhat reliant on elemental attacks were wiped out clean. This brand of defensive maneuver became known as Elemental Hate, and to say that it was frickin' strong would be an understatement. This completely neutered a ton of decks and made dealing damage a long and terrible slog. For all you D&D folks, imagine if there was a spell that let you target an enemy and reduce any one of its stats to 0. That would be busted, right? Well, now imagine if there was a spell that let you reduce all of your opponent's stats to 0. And there's no way to get them back. Well, that's essentially what Lord Von Bloot does, except he doesn't actually have an activation cost for his ability. The very existence of these brands of cards led to a lot of non-elemental strategies rise up in the meta in the later end of Chaotic's lifespan, particularly since later cards allowed for there to be many situations where you'd benefit from not having an element. The game tried to remedy elemental hate by introducing this expend element thing to the game, where you could basically get rid of your element and it would give you a cool power bonus, but this just didn't end up countering the stronger elemental hate in the game. Therefore, if Chaotic comes back, it'll be important to have creatures in Music that can at best deliver specific elemental hate, that being the ability to remove specific elements rather than any element in general. And even if they do want to include specific elemental hate, it has to come at a large cost, rather than just the cost of one Music counter like Elemental Elegy. Or have it be super temporary, and only have it last for a few attacks. Stat hate is welcome to stay because decks can technically operate using multiple different stats, and you can reduce your opponent's stats without completely neutering them in one go. Plus, the game is built around being able to stat boost up the wazoo, so that's something to factor in as well. You can't have situations in which your opponent loses out on one of the major offensive options in the game without any counterplay. That creates a lockdown that shuts down just too many decks. Okay, so here's a funny little high school story from back in the day. A buddy of mine back in high school, Luciano, was an Underworld main, and he absolutely loved this card called Blades. His ability would let you deal 15 damage anytime that you would normally deal 0 damage. Now, there are lots of little 0 damage support attacks in the game, so having Blades get a bunch of cool stuff off while dealing very good damage was a nice little combo all on its own. At some point, my overworld buddy named Mimo pulled a card called Karal Husk Armor, and when he traded it to Luciano, who owned Blades, Luciano proceeded to win like every game he played for a month before our friend group started to panic and pick up specific cards to counter him. See, Karal Husk Armor makes it so that you gain 50 energy, which is a busted stat buff that nearly doubles your usual health stat. The trade-off makes it so that you deal 0 damage if your opponent is even semi-competent. However, Blades makes it so that anytime you would normally deal 0 damage, you deal ample damage instead. Can you see where this combination might be a teeny tiny bit overpowered? If you create cards that let players deal X amount of damage under certain circumstances, you're just begging for your player base to come up with combos to exploit them. Same goes for something like Melody of the Meek. It allows for the player to be guaranteed 3 turns of combat despite having a low health stat, which is oftentimes a compensating factor to prevent an otherwise busted creature from having way too much longevity. Anything that lets you take or deal X amount of damage needs to be very carefully thought through and play tested like crazy to ensure that combos like the Blades Husk Armor synergy never make their way into the newer version of the game. Okay, so this one has some very good examples that work for what not to do in the future. Let's take a look at Void Dirge and Najarin, Fluid Morpher's foe. To start things off, let me introduce you to Mandiblor strategies. These were based around a Danian creature archetype that would benefit from having you bring back your dead worker bugs with cards like Rammer. I don't know how to pronounce that, and you would have your other creatures like Wama benefit from your buddies coming back from the grave. Plus, dead Mandiblors would come back without battle gear equipped, and they usually got a whole bunch of really cool abilities. Plus, this time your opponent had used up a whole bunch of resources taking them down the first time, which made them even harder to take down the second time. It was the closest thing that Chaotic ever had to a stall deck, but it was really interesting and nuanced, unlike things like Chainburn and Exodia in Yu-Gi-Oh! And that's a lot coming from me since I used to main Chainburn. I'm sorry, I wanted to win, okay? You would also have some strats that would involve keeping cards like Machinas or Evilon in the grave, so that your other Mandiblors would be powered up with HP boosts and stat boosts when in combat, making it tougher and tougher to fight through them as the game proceeded. It was basically the opposite of what a lot of decks did. Usually you had your stronger creatures at the front and your weaker ones in the back, but for Mandiblors you actually wanted your earlier creatures to die, that way they could power up the stronger guys at the back. All of these strategies were really cool, or I should say at least they would have been cool if your opponent didn't run Void Dirge and shut you down completely. For the cost of just one Mujic, Void Dirge completely invalidates decks that rely on the graveyard, as it removes 3 cards from the grave. Imagine putting all that time into a deck, and then having it be surprise invalidated by a single card. My buddy Robert was significantly deterred from playing Chaotic when we started packing this bad boy to knock out his Mandiblor decks. I agreed to stop using the card personally, but I can't for the life of me remember if we ever ended up banning it. Sorry Robert, I love you. Another example of a card that completely invalidates certain strategies and races is Nagerin, Fluid Morpher's foe, who would essentially lock the Fluid Morpher archetype out of being able to play the game. Fluid Morphers were an archetype that would gain Mujic every time you played a water attack. But that said, their abilities were super expensive to activate, so even though they generated them very easily, it was pretty balanced. Nagerin, however, not only has the ability to keep up with the gains that Fluid Morphers receive, but he only has to pay 2 Mujic counters to dispel their costly plays. Ultimately, Nagerin is truly the most broken counterplay card in the entire game of Chaotic. As I've noted already, the hallmark of a great trading card game is game design that lets both players feel like they're actually playing the game, and the existence of these aforementioned cards just isn't conducive to dynamic gameplay. There's nothing more disheartening than knowing that your army of Mandiblors that were supposed to give your back row a boost won't matter for jack, just because your opponent is running a single counterplay card. If Chaotic comes back, the creators have to make sure that specific counterplay cards don't completely shut down certain decks, or some players just won't have fun playing the game. This entire last section is basically a condemnation of Zamul. Zamul is dumb. Don't make cards like Zamul. So remember how I said that having a back row is super integral to the dynamic nature of the game? Well, Zamul makes it so that none of your opponent's creatures can activate Mujic cards when Zamul is engaged in combat. In other words, all of the Mujic support cards that you brought into combat to help you win fights are trash, so long as you're fighting this guy. Now, the good news is that you can still at least activate abilities against him, right? Oh wait, you can't use those either. Zamul doesn't give a fuck. Anyway, as explained previously time and time again, you want both players to feel like they can respond to things, so that you've got a good game dynamic going. And Zamul not only cuts out the opponent's ability to do anything, but he cuts it off by just existing. Cards like the Rao Pas Shot Condensation Ceremony similarly lock your opponent out of too many resources for 0 cost, unless you're running like a very specific water deck. And you can run 3 of these damn things in your location deck, by the way. Other cards like Super Cooled Rain weren't technically hard locks, but they basically were in practice. If you opened with this card, you essentially eliminated your opponent's back row without having to travel back there to do it. Super Cooled Rain is back row hate with a different face, and it invalidates your opponent's key points of counterplay. A great solution to such issues is to take a look at cards like Rasnus Assimilated and notice that they are exceptionally well designed. Rasnus' ability is that at the cost of 1 Mujic, he prevents your Danian creatures from being the target of Mujic and abilities until the end of the turn. He only has 1 Mujic counter on him, has an ability that is tribe-specific, requires a back row slot in your army, and has an ability that only negates Mujic and abilities that target you specifically. In other words, Rasnus still lets your opponent play the game, but it limits their options within reason. And that's it. Those are the 5 things that I would do to make Chaotic an even more balanced and dynamic game than it already is. What would you guys like to see if Chaotic came back? What strats did you guys used to play? If you haven't played Chaotic, would there be any chance of you ever getting into it? And if so, what would need to happen for you to want to do that? Let me know in the comments down below. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit all the buttons, and I will see you guys next time. Get ready for the next episode. Hey, 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 hey!